They had taught her to anticipate cruelty. A young nurse from Japan, not yet 20 years old, sat on a rough wooden bench inside a field hospital tent. Her uniform was torn, one sleeve stained with her own blood, and the air was thick with the smells of disinfectant and damp canvas. Opposite her, an American medic knelt and worked on her arm, wrapping it with a methodical gentleness. His hands were firm, his voice a low murmur. She could not decipher his English words, but his tone was unmistakable. There was no hatred in it, no gloating of a victor. There was only a quiet care she was utterly unprepared for. All around her, other captured women were being tended to. Some cradled steaming bowls of stew, consuming more in one sitting than they had seen in weeks. Others were given clean, folded uniforms to replace their tattered ones. This place was not heaven, but it was a profound and unsettling confusion. For years, her training and her culture had insisted that capture was a fate worse than death itself. The ancient code of Bushido, the way of the samurai, had instilled in every soldier and auxiliary a belief that surrender was the ultimate dishonor to one's family, ancestors, and emperor. The shame was meant to be an unbearable weight. She herself had sworn the oath. It was better to die than to be taken. Every woman in this tent had believed that surrender meant certain humiliation, starvation, and torture so horrific that death would be a welcome release. Their commanders had promised it. Their families expected it. But here, in a tent filled with the unfamiliar aromas of coffee and baking bread, that entire world of belief was starting to fracture. The shock of this new reality was almost too much to bear. When the American soldiers first found her, she had braced herself for the impact of a rifle butt, for cruel laughter and the predatory gaze of conquerors. Instead, a soldier had offered her a cigarette. Another had given her a canteen filled with fresh water. When the medic first reached for her wounded arm, she had flinched away, expecting a blow. He had only paused, his expression turning to one of concern before continuing his work. Now, she stared at the pristine white bandage against her skin, wondering if this was all some elaborate deception. The war she had known had no place for such kindness. On the battlefields of the Pacific, she had seen her own countrymen left to die because they were too wounded to march. She had watched as meager rice rations were stretched with tree bark and sawdust. She had witnessed officers striking their own men for showing signs of exhaustion. This, they were told, was discipline. This was honor. In the world she came from, suffering was the price of loyalty, and mercy was a sign of weakness. The facts of the war tell only a fraction of the story. By the time the conflict ended in August of 1945, between 35,000 and 50,000 Japanese soldiers, along with thousands of female auxiliaries, would become prisoners. They had all been fed the same narrative, that the enemy would strip them of their humanity. But the reality they encountered was often the complete opposite. American prisoner of war camps, operating under the rules of the Geneva Convention, were founded not on cruelty, but on procedure. The guiding principle was that a living, healthy prisoner was an asset for intelligence, for propaganda, and as a symbol of moral superiority. For the Japanese prisoners, the very concept of such treatment was beyond imagination. Numbers and treaties, however, cannot capture the feeling of a 20-year-old nurse being handed a bowl of hot soup instead of a sneer of contempt. She had not tasted meat for weeks. The rich broth was a shock to her system, filled with vegetables she no longer recognized. As she ate, her body shook not just from hunger, but from sheer disbelief. Beside her, an older woman began to weep silently into her hands. To cry over a simple meal might seem absurd, but in that moment, the food was more than sustenance. It was proof that the enemy still saw them as human. The irony was staggering. While Japanese propaganda painted a picture of degradation in American hands, here were guards who learned their names and doctors who treated their wounds. Back in Japanese-run camps, Allied prisoners faced starvation, were confined to bamboo cages, and were subjected to back-breaking labor. 1 in every 3 would perish. One system was built for survival, the other was designed for death. Still, trust was a fragile thing. At first, some women refused to eat, certain the food was poisoned. Others hid the small pieces of chocolate they were given, suspecting it was bait for a trap. The nurse herself hesitated when the medic offered her a steaming cup of coffee. She had never smelled it before. When she finally took a sip, the intense bitterness made her cough. The medic let out a soft chuckle, a small human sound that pierced her emotional armor more effectively than any weapon ever could. This was more than a physical shock, it was a cultural one. These women had been raised to be cogs in the imperial war machine, their individuality erased. Their comfort was irrelevant. Their suffering was a testament to their devotion. Yet here, their captors treated them as people. A bed signified that a single body was worth resting. A blanket meant that warmth was not a weakness. And a bandage was a declaration that a single life was worth the effort to heal. The first dawn in the camp felt like waking in another dimension. The women were roused not by the harsh bark of orders or the crash of military boots, but by the gentle aroma of cooking bacon wafting through the barracks. For a moment, they lay frozen in the soft morning light, certain their senses were deceiving them. The call to breakfast was spoken, not screamed, a part of a calm, predictable routine. They moved into a line with shuffling, uncertain steps, half expecting the benevolent illusion to shatter at any second. But it held. They were given trays heavy with eggs, bread, and mugs of hot coffee. Some simply stared, unable to process the sight. One woman whispered that it had to be some kind of test of their will. The suspicion only began to fade when they saw the American guards sitting with identical plates, eating the same meal without a second thought. The young nurse picked up her fork, her hand trembling. She was intimately familiar with a hunger so profound it felt like it was gnawing on her very bones. The first taste was a shock to her system. The rich flavor of the egg, the soft texture of the bread. The sensations were so new, so powerful, they felt almost like a form of violence. Tears welled in her eyes. Around her, some women ate with a quiet, desperate intensity, their ingrained sense of dignity at war with their ravenous hunger. One woman let out a sudden hysterical laugh, immediately clapping a hand over her mouth in shame. But no one yelled. No punishment came. The guards merely looked over with a flicker of curiosity, as if to say that even laughter was permitted here. The beds were a revelation in themselves. They were simple wooden frames with thin mattresses and actual blankets. After months spent sleeping on the hard ground or on bamboo mats, the simple act of lying on a soft surface felt almost sinful, as if comfort were a form of betrayal. The nurse sat on the edge of her cot, clutching the blanket as if it might disappear. For the first time since she had left her home, she possessed something that was hers and hers alone. The blanket became more than an object for warmth. It was a symbol of her own value. By any standard, the camp was not a place of luxury. Barbed wire still lined the perimeter, and armed guards stood their posts. Yet the air itself seemed to thrum with a strange paradox. It was a prison infused with an inexplicable kindness. The afternoons brought another surprise. Work assignments were offered, not ordered. They were entirely voluntary. Some women chose to assist in the kitchens, discovering the alien concept of baking bread with yeast instead of rice flour. Others helped maintain the grounds or worked in small garden plots. One afternoon, a guard handed the nurse a small packet of seeds. He gestured to a patch of empty soil, and though she couldn't understand his words, his meaning was perfectly clear. Make something grow. For a woman trained to seal wounds and manage pain, the idea of nurturing life from the earth was a foreign concept. But as she held the seeds, her fingers shook not with fear, but with a strange, budding excitement. The chance to write letters home was yet another shock. The initial reaction was one of deep skepticism. They were certain the letters would be read and discarded, a cruel joke. But when they were provided with paper and pencils, a hush fell over the room. Slowly, cautiously, they began to write. One woman described the food she ate. Another wrote about the warmth of her bed. Their voices, long suppressed by the rigid code of honor, began to find a new life in ink. These letters, after passing through censors, would eventually reach officials in Japan, who would be confronted with first-hand accounts that directly undermined their own state-sponsored propaganda. The war's end was not a clap of thunder, but a profound silence. When the news of Japan's surrender finally came, the women in the camp didn't celebrate. They sat in stunned disbelief, their world shifting on its axis. The barbed wire still stood, but its meaning had transformed. It no longer marked them as prisoners of war. It marked them as survivors who had witnessed history turn. Repatriation was a slow, deliberate process. The young nurse eventually boarded a ship bound for Yokohama, carrying a small bundle of possessions, a blanket, a pair of eyeglasses, and the letters she had written to her mother. As the ship crossed the vast gray ocean, she was consumed by a single question. What awaited her in a homeland she no longer recognized? Would she be seen as a survivor to be embraced, or a traitor to be shunned? The Japan she returned to was a landscape of ghosts. Cities had been ground into dust. Families were starving. The nation spoke in hushed, haunted tones of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Her own home was gone, her mother a skeletal figure she barely recognized. In the midst of this desolation, the nurse carried the memory of abundance, of hot meals, clean beds, and doctors who had shown her care. To speak of such comforts felt almost profane, a betrayal of her people's suffering. The contradiction was a constant, gnawing presence. How could her time in captivity have felt more humane than the freedom she had returned to? Other women carried similar burdens. In quiet whispers, they shared stories of American guards who knew their names, of nights filled with music, of being treated as individuals for the first time in their lives. These experiences became seeds of change, compelling them to question the very foundations of their world, the meaning of honor, the nature of sacrifice, and the role of women beyond mere service to the state. The quiet revolution that began behind barbed wire had followed them home. For the American occupation, these women became unforeseen allies. Their stories served as bridges of understanding, proving that coexistence was not impossible. Military intelligence would later confirm that the humane treatment of prisoners had yielded extraordinary results, fostering a sense of gratitude that led to voluntary cooperation. Some historians argue this policy of compassion may have even shortened the war, saving countless lives. But for the women, the true legacy was deeply personal. They had been given a glimpse of a world where dignity was not something to be earned through suffering, but a right freely given. Months after her return, the nurse sat with her mother in the ruins of their former home, sharing a thin, bitter soup made from boiled weeds. Her mother, her eyes cast downward, asked quietly about the camp. The nurse hesitated, then spoke of the meals, the beds, the kindness. She described the moment an American doctor placed a pair of eyeglasses on her face and how the blurred world had suddenly snapped into focus. Her mother wept, not from shame, but from relief. "At least," she whispered, "someone remembered you were human." The irony was a sharp, unbearable ache. The empire had promised glory, but delivered only starvation. The enemy had promised nothing, but delivered a kindness that felt like salvation. The world had been turned upside down. The women who survived this paradox could never view war in the same way. Some became quiet advocates for peace, their voices small but steady in a nation struggling to rebuild. Others passed their memories to their children, teaching them that compassion could be a force more powerful than any weapon. Decades later, their testimonies still carried the same note of disbelief. "They gave me chocolate," one former prisoner recalled. "I thought it was a trick. But then I saw the guard eat a piece himself. That moment changed me." The Americans may not have set out to spark a spiritual transformation. Their policies were rooted in pragmatism. But the result was a revelation. Humanity could be a weapon more potent than any bomb. The empire had demanded death before dishonor. The Americans had shown them that a life preserved with dignity was a far more powerful force. The nurse carried this truth with her always. The camp was not a prison, but a strange, paradoxical paradise. A place where, in the hands of her enemies, she had discovered her own undeniable worth.